Welcome to Political Capital, the intersection of money and politics. I'm Karabole Tlhahla. One would have to have been under a rock to have missed the turbulent and decisive last couple of weeks in South Africa, which culminated in the resignation of Jacob Zuma as head of state. In this show, I will talk to SACP's first Secretary General, Mapaila, who was one of the foremost people calling for Zuma's resignation. But first, let's take a look at the last 12 Zuma years that led us to this moment.
What an eventful dozen years it has been for Jacob Zuma. You could argue his troubles began on June the 2nd, 2005, when Schabir Shaik was sentenced to 15 years in prison for soliciting bribes and payments for Zuma. Less than 2 weeks on, President Thabo Mbeki fired Zuma as deputy president. A week later, the National Prosecuting Authority says it'll charge Zuma with corruption and fraud. More than a year later, the charges are dropped on a technicality. The following year, Zuma was elected president of the ANC and a shoo-in for power. Just 10 days later, the MPA charged Zuma again, adding racketeering, money laundering and tax evasion. The following year, a judge threw out the charges, saying they were unlawful on procedural grounds. Less than 2 weeks on, the ANC recalled President Thabo Mbeki, opening the way to Zuma power. In 2009, Zuma is inaugurated as President of the Republic of South Africa at the Union Buildings in Pretoria. In 2014, he won a second term, albeit with a reduced majority. Tens of thousands march in Pretoria in April 2017 as the Zuma Must Go campaign intensifies. The final nail in the coffin, his nemesis, Cyril Ramaphosa, takes the presidency of the ANC.
Jacob Zuma was haunted by numbers in his personal and public life, from the 18 charges of corruption, fraud, money laundering and racketeering to the 249 million rand spent on his Nkandla homestead in his rural KwaZulu-Natal. Here are some highlights of the political moves made by Jacob Zuma. Former President Jacob Zuma has been South Africa's #1 citizen for 9 years. In that time, this cool ANC cat survived 8 motions of no confidence votes. He started his presidency turbulently and ended thus. Zuma's presidency was born out of internal party strife. In 2005, then ANC president and head of state, Thabo Mbeki suspended Zuma as deputy president of the republic, following the conviction of Zuma's financial advisor, Schabir Shaik, for soliciting a bribe for Zuma. Seen as a victim of an autocrat, the affable Zuma quietly mobilized within the African National Congress ranks, ultimately ascending to power in 2007 at the now infamous Polokwane Conference. 9 months into the job as ANC president, in Machiavellian fashion, Zuma, the chess player and strategist, quickly dispensed of Thabo Mbeki and his influence in the party. Mbeki was unceremoniously booted and forced to resign as president of the republic. What followed was a massive exodus of senior ANC officials, which also went on to form Congress of the People. Alas, Zuma's political moves were only surpassed by the numbers that filled his presidency. From stumbling on them during his speeches to reshuffling his cabinet at least 11 times, a first for a democratic South African president. Zuma's 9 years as head of state were characterized by a high level of debt, reaching a peak of 790 billion rand, or 51% of GDP, in the second quarter of 2017. But the biggest hole in the country's coffers was the billions of dollars wasted through corruption and poor leadership. Zuma's court numbers are even more impressive. South Africa's former president is awaiting a decision from the National Prosecuting Authority as to whether he will face the 18 charges with 783 counts of corruption, fraud, money laundering and racketeering. He also stands accused of looking the other way as unprecedented looting worth billions of rands of state-owned entity funds thrived under his leadership. Mr. Unpopular, Zuma's rule as ANC president was highlighted by the drop in national membership, a trend that became entrenched in his second term. His and his party's reputation was sullied by accusations of state capture. But Not all numbers associated with Zuma have been bad. According to Statistics South Africa, since Zuma came into office, life expectancy in South Africa has jumped from 56.8 years in 2009 to 62.4 years in 2016. Deaths due to TB dropped from just under 70,000 in 2009 to under 38,000 in 2015. Msholozi, as he is affectionately known, changed government policy to improve access and uptake of ARV treatment. Zuma will be remembered for is the 249 million rand price tag of building his Nkandla homestead in his rural KwaZulu-Natal province. Or is it?
Number 6, I guess.
0,000. 0,0000000. Yeah, basically.
100,000,405.
200 billion. 1.
But whatever your number, there is no denying Jacob Gedleyihlekisa Zuma did one hell of a number on South Africa. Good evening and welcome to Political Capital, the intersection of politics and money. I'm Karabole Tlhatla, and joining me is my special guest, who is SACP's first Deputy Secretary, Mr. Mapaila. Mr. Mapaila, for your time, I thank you.
Thank you,
Mr. Mapaila, President Jacob Zuma has handed in his resignation. Long overdue from the SACP side?
Yeah, quite long overdue. We really want to thank him for ultimately acceding to the request of the ANC because he took a little bit more time trying to negotiate. We don't know what was the content of that negotiation. Should have been a simple matter that the ANC feels in order to prepare itself for the coming elections effectively, he should not be the head of state. And this is shared generally with the views of the people of South Africa, and therefore in that case we want to thank him for finally living in a most dignified way by handing his resignation.
But some will argue that he was enabled by the party. Does the party feel like the president is too empowered to take essentially what should be collective decision, considering that it becomes a collective consequence? What have we learned about the powers, the unfettered powers, that President Jacob Zuma exercised, maybe by virtue of being president of both the country and the party?
Well, that's a big question and a big issue for us going forward as a country, that the makers of our constitution, including this current president of the ANC, Comrade Ramaphosa, had in mind the caliber of a president that everyone could think about,
so
like President Mandela at the time and his generation. And quite clearly, it's quite, we now from experience can learn that it is not possible perhaps to set the bar that high. Mm-hmm. But that's the ideal we should seek to emulate and go to. But we should therefore put mechanism that appreciates the weaknesses of the individuals to reach us to that level of the generation of President Mandela, Umgof Mbeki, Comrade Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, Masisulu, Malilien Ngoyi, and others, who were just of a particular level of ethical behavior and respect for the people and respect for even their own organization. So that's the challenge that we have. The Constitution gives the president too much power. And I think that's an issue that most certainly we should be able to deal with. But it's also a question that under constitutional democracy, we also have the judiciary, which also plays an important role. We also have Parliament.
It's been the last goalkeeper of South Africa's constitutional gains.
Yeah, of course. We also have Parliament, which has recently come up to play a much more effective role. And that's very important, that all of these different branches of our democratic institutions are functioning well. And it is that will make our democracy much more revitalized, much more dynamic and robust And out of that, we can have a much better and quicker transformation agenda.
Cyril Ramaphosa was the SACP's candidate of choice. You really broke out of the gates and supported him from the onset. You got a sense that he is by far the one you think could better serve South Africa. But when it comes to the SACP, that candidate has to serve two, if you will, two polar opposite interests. One is that Cyril Ramaphosa is largely seen as business friendly, but he stands there as a president who has to lead a tripartite movement that is made up of people that care about union issues, which is bread and butter issues, and not necessarily, you know, capital markets. How is he going to balance these things? Have you had an extensive chat with him as to how he is seen and how he will be able to deliver, considering, like I said, the varying constituencies that he has to serve?
I think for the record purposes, let's say that we do not endorse individual candidates. We endorsed a set of principles that any leader of the ANC who will be elected should follow. And it so happened that Comrade Ramaphosa fitted those basic principles that we outlined. And we also provided space and platforms within our structures for him to campaign, to share with us those views and to be engaged by our comrades, which he has done, and we want to appreciate him for that. And I think coming to our question is that the ANC and our movement as a whole, we don't follow a presidential system where the individual decides on their policies. We follow a party political system. The policies are policies of the party. Of course, there are times where the government sometimes overtakes the policy making of the ANC, largely because of the capacity of government. But largely, when there are those strategic issues that are emerging, there's a need for the ANC collective to come together, the need for the alliance to come together and reflect on those things. To the extent that Comrade Ramaphosa may be seen as friendly to the market, we also see him as friendly to the working class. And I think that's a very important dynamism of our movement. We hope that if the market warms up to him, there will be more investment in the country. We can then be able to tackle problems of poverty, working together with big capital, because big capital has huge resources that largely it is what in the stock exchange, in speculative market, and not in productive investment of our country. And we want to ask big business to come to play, to work together with the government and the democratic forces in this country to develop and face together the challenges of our country without necessarily pointing at government.
After the break, we continue our conversations about the Zuma legacy that will continue to stay with South Africa. Welcome back to Political Capital, your intersection of money and politics. I'm Karabole Tlatla. The Zuma years may be behind us, but his wasteful expenditure and the litany of broken state-owned enterprises will stay with us. In the second part, Soli Mapaila of the SACP discusses what change he would like to see in government and what lessons he has learned from the Zuma years. I'm going to try and move this conversation a bit further out. Now, what we saw with, for instance, the entire presidency of Jacob Zuma, from, as you say, one-time hero to not quite how he ended. He didn't end as a hero. In fact, some might say disgrace to a certain extent. President Zuma united us and separated us, if you will. He united us in a sense that more of us were surprised by his leadership, at the self-serving nature of his leadership, and what basically was an omission of the bigger picture as in the public. But he also divided us in terms of he belonged to a certain political clique, and it was up to that party to resolve the issue with the president. I ask this, towards the end of this presidency, I got a sense that that the conversation within the broader South African public had moved from getting rid of President Jacob Zuma to whom gets rid of President Jacob Zuma. As in, opposition politicians wanted to use it as a political score, and it was important for the ANC to also be seen as dealing with its own problems. This problem could be very dangerous for all involved. When you think about that, how important is it that you have a cadre who will not negotiate with the national executive, but will do as asked by the time of the national executive?
Yeah, it's always an assumption that once you reach the pinnacle of being the leader of the ANC, you are the frontline cadre, the number one cadre of the movement. We learn from you the best examples. And if you give the worst of what is possible, you detach the movement from its ability to mobilize the people that over the years had backed up its ideas and supported its programs. So that is why any leader of the ANC has to be confined to collective leadership and reduce the notion of a personality cult, that they think they are bigger than the movement, which is what ultimately President Zuma became. And we kept on raising some of the issues that comrades should be able to engage with him effectively in meetings. And when there are problems, we raised the issues, for instance, of corporate capture a long time ago. We put them on the table. He didn't care. We raised the issues about when he was firing Minister Gordon and his deputy, it was Jonas at the time, and he didn't care that these were coming from his comrades who were warning him about the information that he had. And at that time, when the leadership could not make him accountable to the collective leadership, we knew that definitely he's fully above the organization. So we should never allow any leader to be above the organization. But at the same time, we must equally accept that there's a leader of the organization. So there must be a balance between the two, so that there's authority within the organization, whilst there's enough space for critical and robust engagement, constructive criticism, not destructive criticism, so that all cadres of the movement, we can learn from that space. And when the National Executive Committee meets, all of us can look forward to its outcomes.
President Jacob Zuma, good or bad, he was good for our jurisprudence. Through his court trial, we were able to see really some of the shortcomings of South Africa's safety net, if you will, from that kind of absolute power. But he was also a president who not only taught us that, he had great, maybe not to great effect, but he had awesome political moves. The fact that his NEC was so beholden to him, that so much of the NEC, you know, really looked at him as somebody who can change materially their lives. How important is it that in the next executive, and i.e. that of Cyril Ramaphosa, that we have less NEC members who are beholden to the president, whether through employment or being ministers or being in cabinet?
Well, that's a very important aspect, because President Zuma was able to properly pull the strings of patronage to get what he wants, and that's why those who were critical of him, like Comrade Nzimande and Praveen and few others, were victims, Derek Hanekom and so forth. Those who knew they could live beyond his strings of patronage became victims. But of course, and I think that it's important, the point that you are raising, that in the process of organizational renewal of the ANC, we need to gravitate to a situation where cadres of the ANC who are elected into different leadership positions can still serve their professional lives differently, and not see the national executive as a center of their profession, like not see politics as
the end all and be all.
Yeah. So in any case, we are supposed to be revolutionaries, or aspirant revolutionaries, if you like. We are aspirant revolutionaries, supposing to be revolutionaries. So when we accept leadership into office, it's because of our commitment to selflessly serve the people. So if we can't do that, then we become victims. If we go there without practicing our professions, then we become victims to patronage. But at the same time, there's a relationship between the political structure like the national executive, that is the custodian of ANC policy, or the movement policy, in our case the central committee, that when you deploy cadres of the movement, you take your topmost cadres to go and make sure that they can implement the decisions proper. But that's also a sign of weakness of our cadreship development system. But ultimately, you should not worry whether it's a member in a branch or a region or district, that every time when the ANC or the alliance components have released their statements, have released, in the case of the ANC, the January 8 statement, which we regard as the most important framework of our programs for the year, any cadre at different locations can read that statement and understand what is required of them as cadres of the movement. So that, of course, will take time. But we appreciate that going forward, people shouldn't think that because you are in the national executive, therefore you must be in parliament or you must be in cabinet. They should be deployed in any other sphere where the movement deems fit, for instance, in different locations of our society.
Leader, you have, it's been a grueling campaign period leading up to December's elective conference, and it's been equally bruising to watch the ANC try to rid itself of the past, and in this case represented by Jacob Zuma. I want to know what the SACP expects of the new president, of Cyril Ramaphosa. What are the three wishes that you have, that you wish he would prioritize from the SACP point of view?
Well, the quickest one is to deal and to dismantle the parasitic networks that have now engulfed the state system. Without dealing with that, we will not be able to run an appropriate clean governance. That's one of the first tasks. Of course, going forward is to make sure that we refocus the rebuilding of our economy and make sure that we can build confidence with the masses, and the ANC can reconnect proper with the masses, and by addressing corruption where it arises, irrespective of who it affects. And in that form, the people can see that his leadership means business, and the new collective leadership means business. And organizationally, for the president never to become a part of a faction, including those that supported him in the run-up to the national conference. He should not be beholden to them, including us. He should be beholden to the policies of the ANC and alliance movement. One of the failures of President Zuma, and we did alert him to this, and we said to him, Comrade President, please act above the factions in the organization so that you can play a unifying role. And he didn't do that. That is why he ended up going to this conference siding with one particular faction. So that will be one of our expectations, organizational, so that he can then lead an organizational renewal process and unify the movement as a whole, reconnect it with the masses, and therefore revitalize our national democratic revolution, which is a program of transforming the lives of the people of South Africa.
My parting question is that the tripartite as a whole has done well for the country, and it also has failed the country through its appointees and people that it sent into leadership positions. But the one consistent thing that has been there since taking over government really is the high unemployment figures that we still have in South Africa. I mean, they decreased a little bit from the figures that we saw recently, now at 26%, but that's still 26% of potentially a large amount of our youth that are unemployed. Those people are also a threat for this tripartite alliance, for your movement, for the ANC. They will not vote unless they feel like they're part of the story of progress. How are you going to make those people feel like change is coming, that jobs will come?
Well, we've adopted very serious programs, for instance, the framework of radical socio-economic transformation. That's a program that is meant for such groupings of people in our society, the poor and the working class, including, of course, the middle strata, those that have qualified but now are having difficulty to find space for to express their capacities and skills appropriately through work. But also, it's we've adopted broad framework for economic transformation. And if we do it well and refocus the performance of the South African economy, we can absorb as many people as is possible into the workplace. And on the one hand, we need also to develop mechanisms of creating jobs where people stay. And that's why the Communist Party has spoken extensively about township and rural economies, so that where the people are, we can then generate new economic platforms. Meaning that we can't accept the current limitations of the market system, the capitalist system, in the manner that it operates. We need an intervention of government. For instance, we need to refocus the function of the state-owned enterprises, for instance, so that they're not just instruments that can even easily be captured. They are pillars of our transformation agenda. If properly focused, they can contribute significantly to the development of our country in skills, as well as in making sure that we deal a major blow to unemployment in our country. But also, big business itself should be forced to play a role in the development of their own country, particularly locally based business. There should be no reason why they could look into this country only from a profit-making initiative, rather than generally wanting also to contribute to the development of their own country so that they can do better business in the future.
It continues to be an interesting path. Until the next episode, stay with us here on Political Capital.